Good afternoon, all. Tzarayim Tovim. This week's Parsha discussion is called Parsha Terumah, using the colors and materials of our horizontal world to elevate us vertically. As I've shared with you, my husband and I spent 3 weeks in Israel this past December through January. As always, when in Israel, we like to go to different shuls and be part of different communities and experiences. This time, between the two of us, we were in 7 different davening communities. Most of them were not anything special physically, and that is not often what I'm looking for. Oh, as you know, I love color and beautiful environments. But when I think back, my favorite davening experience was a relatively new minyan that meets in a space not their own, but rented in a kollel. But that was absolutely the experience that made the most significant impact on me. The beauty was in the voices, male and female together. The experience was in response to the incredible energy and intentionality in the room. Community permeated, song dominated, davening was wonderful, and the colors and the beautiful aesthetics were found in these elements. We will, Imir Hashem, go back there. Don't get me wrong. I so appreciate beautiful environments, but they have to come with a soul, with an experience that pulls us vertically towards God and a higher purpose, not just fall flat in architectural wonder. I do find beauty and spirit in beautiful structures, art, dance, and so many different creative experiences and expressions of the human spirit. This week, we read in Parshat Terumah. It is indeed about pretty colors and materials and all that is glittery and valuable. I can imagine and I can see it in my mind's eye. Of course, this discussion is related to the myriad of details regarding the Mishkan, the sanctuary that the Bnei Yisrael are to make for God during their travels in the desert. There are actually 13 different materials that go into the process of creating the Mishkan, just as instructed by God through God's agent Moshe. Everyone is to participate in the process. In verse 8 of chapter 25, in the beginning of our Parsha, we read, "They shall make a sanctuary for me so that I can dwell amongst them." Let's look at this verse in its context. God says to Moshe, God speaks to Moshe saying, "Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yichu li terumah me'et kol ish asher yidabenu libo tiku et terumati." Speak to the children of Israel and have them take for me an offering from every person whose heart inspires them to do generously. You will take my offering. And these are the offerings that you will take: gold, silver, copper, blue, purple, crimson wool, linen, goat hair, ram skins, dyed red, tachash skins, acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for anointing oil and for the incense, shoham stones, filling the stones for the ephod and the choshen, and they will make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. According to all that I show you, the pattern of the Mishkan and the pattern of all the vessels, you shall do. God instructs. Kol asher mar'eh otcha, everything I show you, kain tasu, so you shall do. Rashi teaches us that the value of the sanctuary is precisely that God is to dwell in it, and only in this way is it truly a mikdash, a holy place, a sanctified space. As such, while all the materials and fabrics and woods and other prescribed details are complicated and specific, they are to relate to the special nature of what makes this mikdash a space worthy of God's Shekhinah, God's dwelling in it. And what gives it that worth is the efforts of those who build and maintain it, not the materials themselves. This is what man is all about, writes Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi in the Hasidic classic Tanya. This is the purpose of God's creation and of the creation of all the worlds, higher and lower, that there be made for God a dwelling in the lower realms. The first such dwelling to be constructed, and the one which serves as a prototype for all subsequent efforts to make a home for God in the physical world, is the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary built by the children of Israel in the Midbar, in the Sinai desert, following the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. All these physical substances, including gold, silver, copper, wood, wool, linen, animal skins, oil, and sometimes the count is 13, sometimes the count is 15, depending on how you count the different items, represent a cross-section of the mineral, vegetable, and animal resources of the physical universe, and the human resources invested in their workmanship. This is all forged into an edifice dedicated to our service of God, in which God, in turn, chooses to commune with and dwell with us. The tabernacle itself, the menorah, the coverings, the special tables, utensils, wood planks, and all the other details are so carefully indicated, each and every one contributing to the entirety of this place and this space, worthy of God's continued presence. Rashi and Rashbam teach that the menorah should be designed so that all its candles point and lean toward the center, showing unity and upward lifting towards God and God's presence. Sforno adds that the 6 branches of the menorah represent the 6 different domains of intellectual secular knowledge that we as humans pursue: physics, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, music, and mathematics. While this is our human prerogative to do so, we must remember that all such endeavors should be directed toward the central branch, indicative of the authority of Torah and Ribono Shel Olam. This very concrete set of materials and their use is replete with symbolism well beyond their physicality. The point is not just to see the color or feel the material or appreciate the wood or admire the gold, but rather to see how it is infused with meaning beyond its concrete self. This is how we are to function in our world. It is the very concept of Hidur Mitzvah, namely how we embellish and amplify our performance of the various deeds with which we are engaged, and that doing so should be pleasant, meaningful, and infused with beauty and purpose. There are 10 curtains of the tabernacle, which the Or Chaim states are reminiscent of the 10 statements with which God created our world, as we are taught in Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, verse 1. Martin Buber and others actually show the correlation between each detail of the process of creating the Mishkan and the 10 utterances of God in the creation of the world. The 10 Sfirot in Jewish mysticism may replicate these. We have the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. Everything means and stands for something. Just as God carefully and intentionally created the space for us in our world, in God's universe, we create space for God in carefully constructing the Mishkan on our level, on our horizontal plane, so to speak. It is in this spirit, according to the Gur Aryeh, that God does aid us in every detail along the way through the noted directions given. And we also note at this point in Parshat Terumah that this will be repeated several times through the book of Shemot. And we will be discussing those repetitions and why we have them. God gives the instructions, God supervises, we have Betzalel who will build, and then we have the completion where it's indicated that this was the recipe, this is what we did, and we have completed successfully. Interestingly enough, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav shalom, posits that many may think of this as one of the most boring aspects of the Torah. Who gets so wrapped up in design detail? But in fact, we do not know the details that went into God's plan as briefly narrated in the beginning of Breshit, as it appears to us as merely fiat. God says, and it was so. And we see this 10 times within the story of creation, the first chapter of Breshit. However, the fact is that it must have been extremely detailed beyond our understanding, as we have discerned in so many attempted explanations of how our world has come into being. Think of it as somewhat like when you go to a beautiful affair, say a wedding, or walk into a gorgeous house or building, and are not bothered with all the details of the work that went into creating or building it, but are focused on the experience that you will have there. The multitudinous degree of details indicated for the Mishkan and later the Beit HaMikdash do not even come close to what God must have done in planning and bringing our world into being. And as part of our existence. Perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of this lengthy text of such detail in Parshat Terumah is to remind us of this. In fact, we see the use of these elements in so much of the ritual practice of the Bnei Israel during, for example, the elaborate and highly detailed service of the Kohen HaGadol in the Avodah service of Yom Kippurim and Masechet Yoma of the Gemara, and reflected in our Machzorim that we use every Yom Kippur. The Aron, the Holy Ark, the Shulchan, the table, and the menorah are to represent the integration of our reaching for God, our intellectual pursuits, and the prosperity of the lives we've been granted. So, this Mishkan and the later Beit HaMikdash are clearly planned intentionally and carefully to remind us that within the beauty of the ceremony, we are to be mindful of its purpose. To have intentionality. Enter our Haftarah regarding Shlomo and his building of the Beit HaMikdash. Chapters 5, verse 26 through chapter 6:13. Interesting, 6:13, Taryag, of Malachim. Once again, we are given details about building materials, participation of individuals, here both from Shlomo and Hiram, according to a treaty that they made. We read, Hashem natan chachma l'Shlomo kasher diber lo. God had given Shlomo wisdom, just as promised. We read in the translation, but it says, as he said to him. There was a friendship between Hiram and Shlomo, and the two of them made a treaty. Then King Shlomo, it says, V'ya'al hamelech Shlomo mes mikol Yisrael, imposed forced labor on all of Israel. So there, in Shemot, we're going to read where everybody's going to bring their gifts, and Moshe is actually going to have to tell them to stop. Here, we read of imposed labor. But again, imposed labor, not the same as, for example, Avdu b'Mitzrayim, but in terms of having everybody participate in this particular action, in this particular intentional building of a place for God and the people to come together. The amount of labor and people to complete this building of the Beit HaMikdash is given here in incredible detail. We read about huge blocks of choice stone to be quarried, that they are laid with hewn stones, that the masons and those from Gaval helped shape these. In other words, bringing in experts, just like we bring in Betzalel in Shemot. The timber, the stones, the grounding, all of this. So note how this is referenced in terms of the history up to this point, because in the middle of all this detail, in verse 6 of chapter 6, we see, Vayihi b'shmonim shana v'arba me'ot shana l'tzei b'nei Yisrael me'at Mitzrayim b'shana ha'revi b'chodesh zo hu ha'chodesh ha'sheni l'melech Shlomo al Yisrael v'yeven be'et Hashem. It's the 480th year after the Israelites left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, that is the second month. In the 4th year of his reign over Israel, this is when Shlomo began to build the house of God. The house that Shlomo builds for God, and we're given again the details, 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. We're told about the portico, we're told about the windows, we're told about the lattices, we're told about the outside walls, all of these things. And then, when he finishes building the house, we read, Vayihi davar Hashem el Shlomo lemor. The word of God comes to Shlomo saying, Habayit hazeh asher ata boneh im tilek b'chokoti ve'et mishpoti ta'aseh u'shmart me'kol mitzvotai lalecha b'hem v'hakimoti et dvarei itach asher dibarti el David avicha. With regard to this house that you are building, Shlomo, if you follow my laws and observe my rules and faithfully keep my commandments, I will fulfill for you the promise that I gave to David, your father. V'shachanti betoch b'nei Yisrael v'lo azov et ami Yisrael. I will dwell in the midst of my children Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. So here we parallel our earlier verse from our Parsha, which tells us that God will in fact dwell in this place. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. You will build this house, and I will dwell amongst you. Again in our Haftarah, there's much talk of adornment and beauty, as well as skilled and specifically instructed labor, similar to what we saw in Parshat Terumah. The finest of materials are to be used. Again, gold, cedar wood, other fine materials. As we return to chapter 25 of our Parsha, we see in verse 9, Kachol asher ani mar'eh otcha et tavnit hamishkan ve'et tivnit kol kalav v'chein tasu. According to all that I show you, the pattern of the Mishkan and the pattern of its vessels, so you shall do. You shall make the ark of acacia wood. You should overlay it with pure gold. You should put the golden rings on it. You should make poles. You should carry the poles. And you shall place the ark of the testimony, which of course the Torah goes in, where I tell you, and you will make an ark cover, a kaporet, a cover of Zahav Torah. Acknowledging that every word of Torah is important and indispensable, what does all of this mean? Let us explore several possibilities. 1. The Rambam teaches us that the Mishkan and later the Beit HaMikdash, as well as our places of worship today, are but mere substitutions for what happened at Har Sinai. While we are told very little about the details of that gathering, we can only imagine the power of voices together, the meaning of the gathering, the feeling of community, the unity of purpose, much like I feel in a wonderful and intentional davening experience. This is the reason, according to Rambam, that we are given all these specific details. 2. Every element has its own meaning and purpose and cannot be substituted. One might wonder if the amount of pure gold is to represent, for example, the fire of God's presence and our awe at its bright and even blinding purity. So what does all of this mean? Perhaps suggested by some Chazal, the answer goes like this. We have no concept of the amount of detail that went into God's creation of the world, and these instructions are perhaps to convey an appropriate amount of detail for us to absorb. Further, just as God is so connected to all that God created and cannot separate God's self from God's creation, the human hands and efforts and artistic skills are so meaningful to the individuals who craft these elements that they can no more separate themselves from their product than can God. 3. Another thought is that when viewed from above, the Mishkan was seen as the perfect Adam, or earth creature. The placement of the different parts, the coloration chosen for various components, represented perhaps God's intended aspirations for perfection in God's created beings. The Midrash and biblical commentaries, as well as Kabbalistic and Hasidic expounders of Torah, elaborate on this theme, describing the Mishkan as a model of the human being, of the physical universe, and of creation as a whole. The Mishkan's furnishings, or vessels, for example, are seen as representations of the various organs and faculties of the human being. The ark, containing the Torah, corresponds to the mind, intellect, and faculty of speech. The menorah, with its bright light, to the eyes and the sense of sight. The table that held the showbread, to the sense of taste. The inner altar on which the kataret, the incense, was offered, refers to the sense of smell. And the outer altar on which the animal and meal offerings are brought represent the digestive system and other functional organs. 4. Perhaps this is God sharing that dream and setting for the human world, which operates on a horizontal plane of vertical vision that reestablishes the primary relationship between God and the created human being and family. Similarly, when those engaged in this work consider the instructions and they're abiding by them, the communication channel between them and God can be profound and replete, pregnant even with meaning. In other words, as the Hasidic masters suggest, there are two possible ways in which to define the concept of a physical place and structure that serves as a mikdash l'Shem, as a dwelling for God. 1, a place where and through which God chooses to reveal God's self to the human being, and B, a place where and through which we serve God. Of course, we understand that the Mishkan was both. So many possible levels of symbolic meaning abide here. As Ibn Ezra asks regarding symbolism and its meaning in terms of how we feel the Shekhinah and interact with it, Ki ha'adam olam katan o ha'olam adam gadol. Is one person a small world, or is the world a big person? Ki ha'adam olam katan o olam adam gadol. I love so many different types of art. I will often look at a piece of art or an amazing sculpture or structure and imagine that the artist has reduced their sense of infinity to a finite expression. And I, as the observer, have the task to blast back to infinity, perhaps that perceived by the artist, perhaps something totally different. But that is the nature of infinity. God is the artist par excellence, and we are clearly God's artistic products. What we do as created beings in our attempts to attach ourselves to the infinite nature of God, to the Ein Sof, will vary for each individual. As we do so, somehow, each of us get to create the totality of all that God has created. Are we the miniature piece of God? Or is God the largesse of us, or the other way around? As we think about that, perhaps we can carry ourselves backward from our own gathering posts and their beauty, in which we find comfort, our synagogues, our shuls, our gathering spaces, and think about the Beit HaMikdash, and in turn the Mishkan, and ultimately back to Har Sinai, at which we all were present, and we all were focused vertically. Let the horizontal beauty around us be an inspiration for all of us to reach upward vertically and try to be the best we can be and bring God into God's dwelling places on earth. Shabbat Shalom.